Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of the news magazine The International Interest, and he joins us now via Skype from London. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme. A couple of things to talk about, but let's start with actually this report about Russia assisting the Wagner Group. And I guess this is part of what's been creating the tension between the East and Tripoli.
There is something deeply ironic with international support base for the parties in Libya, and that is that it is the balance of support, the balance of international support for either party that actually brought about this ceasefire. And the reason I say that is because the reason Khalifa Haftar of the East was able to take so much territory and march against what was an impotent force of the internationally recognized government of national accord, the reason Haftar was able to do that was because of international support. So it was only when Turkey intervened internationally, sending its drones, sending its Syrian fighters or mercenaries, call them whatever you wish, that managed to establish this military equilibrium that brought about a ceasefire. The interesting thing is, I don't think that Russia wants to see Haftar rule Libya. I think what Russia is doing is it's flexing its muscle in the region. Russia is trying to say, look, I single-handedly rescued Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and I am single-handedly helping Haftar to survive in Libya, and I've delivered him all the way to Tripoli. And even though he's backed by UAE and Egypt, I have managed to maneuver as a new power broker. In light of the US withdrawing under Donald Trump and taking less of an interest in the region, I am the alternative superpower. So that's what Russia is doing. And that's why, while it supports Khalifa Haftar, it set up a Libya working group with Turkey, which is supporting the other side. In other words, it's working with Turkey, which is supporting the other side, while supporting Khalifa Haftar, who is antagonistic to the allies in Tripoli. So in other words, when we're seeing Russia cementing itself, they're both using the ceasefire. Turkey is using the ceasefire to establish its bases in Misrata on the coast with the Mediterranean, so it can project its power on the Mediterranean and also secure the base in Al-Watiya, the air base, while Russia is securing Al-Jufra and some of these other military bases and using Wagner to maintain control over the oil facilities, which is putting a significant pressure on the GNA and ensuring that Russia remains a power broker and that the power cannot return back to Germany, the UN, and the US. It's important to note here, the power brokers in Libya today are Turkey on one side, Russia on the other. It's that Russia and Turkey managed to snatch the Libya portfolio from the likes of Germany and the United Nations, and they're very keen to protect it. So when we're looking at Russia sending these planes, like backing Haftar and boosting the Eastern Bloc in a very crude, ironic way that is symptomatic of the nature of politics, it actually helps to guarantee the ceasefire rather than actually hindering it.
All right, so why is there no other international interest beyond Turkey and Russia, really, in solving the issues of Libya?
There is international interest, but there is no international plan or clear international plan on the part of Europe, on the part of the US, and on the part of some of the other international players, including the likes of France, which gambled in the early days on the government of national accord and then gambled on Haftar and switched sides in order to try to salvage what is increasingly becoming an alarming situation for French influence in the Sahel region, in West Africa generally, them moving away from the CFA-backed franc. I think when it comes to the plans for the international powers, Europe's interest is only insofar as it concerns terrorism and the migration. So Germany has always been sort of, well, can we get these parties to talk? The US knows that whoever wins is going to go to Washington. So the US is not particularly interested if Haftar wins or if the GNA wins. At the end of the day, US believes that all roads lead to Washington. At the end of the day, everybody's going to come and ask the US for support. So it's just watching and waiting to see who the winner is. Turkey, the reason why it has a plan is because it's worried about the Mediterranean, this encroaching chokehold by Greece, Italy, Israel, France, Egypt, who are trying to encroach on what is an expansion of Turkish power in the Mediterranean, while Russia is using this vacuum of an absence of Western power to assert itself in Libya. So I think it's not necessarily a lack of international interest, but a lack of how do we proceed in Libya. Italy has its own interest. France has its own interest. Germany has its own interest. There's the Sudanese mercenaries. There's the Syrian mercenaries now being sent into Libya. But the key point in all this is that the Libyans themselves can't agree between themselves. And that's why when you mention Fathi Bashagha, for example, being reinstated. The reason that he was removed in the first place was a bid by Sarraj to break the hold of a certain city called Misrata, which pursues its own domestic and foreign policy. Sarraj wants to break the back of Misrata so that he can centralize the power. But Bashar Gaara managed to rally and managed to get to unite the individual factions that were competing in Misrata and reminded them that they're only powerful if they're united. So Sarraj now has another problem whereby the GNA is going back to its position as a bunch of parties jostling with one another who only united because Haftar looked like he was about to win. Now Haftar doesn't look like he's about to win. They're back to wrestling with one another and bickering, and that is the greatest threat to the ceasefire, not any real international power.
So what about Bashar Gaara then? What significance does he play in all of this? I mean, there were protests against issues that fall under his ministry, I guess. Those don't suddenly disappear.
I think it's important for viewers generally to understand that both parties in Libya, the East and the West, their power stems from external factors. It stems from international support, not domestic support. Let's remember that Sarraj, who's the head of the internationally recognized government, when they agreed in Morocco to establish the government, the militias of Tripoli tried to prevent him from entering. They stood guard on the coast to make sure Sarraj couldn't enter. So he had to go round to another city and then come from behind them, and he popped up behind them in the morning and said, "Hi guys, I'm here. Like I arrived in Tripoli." Likewise, in the East, Haftar is only as powerful as the UAE and Egypt make him. It's not because they have a popular mandate. And that's why these protests, it's significant that they took place after the ceasefire, because it's the first time that the militias were suddenly weakened and the first time that people were able to breathe. And the people made clear that they don't want Bashar Gaara, they don't want Sarraj, they don't want Haftar, they don't want Aqil Saleh in the East. What Bashar Gaara tried to do was, when the protesters were going against him and against Sarraj, Bashar Gaara tried to position himself to be pro-protest. He said the protesters have legitimate concerns, they should be allowed to protest and the like. Sarraj deemed it as a challenge to him. What are you doing? Are you trying to use these protests to channel and launch a leadership bid for yourself? So Sarraj declared an emergency law on the basis of trying to tackle COVID-19 and tried to ban the protest. And he put Bashar Gaara under an investigation committee. And Sarraj hoped that that would split the Misrata group that Fathi Bashar Gaara belongs to into two, whereby he would be able to dent their power and Sarraj would be able to centralize that power to increase his leverage in any negotiations. But Bashar Gaara is a wily fox. Bashar Gaara managed to rally the support for Sarraj to reinstate him. And we're back in this awkward status quo whereby we have a GNA on paper, we have an internationally recognized government on paper, but in reality, it's a bunch of militias that managed to find some legal umbrella to give it some sort of legitimacy that cannot agree between themselves. And that just like the East, the reality is that there is a deep disconnect between the people and these militias, and it's important to note this particular point. In 2014, when the war started, the people protested against the militias while the militias were starting to fight one another. In other words, the Libyan people said, this is a war between the elites. It's not our war. We need the militias to surrender their weapons, and we need a centralization of military authority. The militias are having none of it, because if they surrender their weapons, they automatically lose their political power. That's the dilemma in Libya. And that's why this ceasefire was brought about by the international powers who threatened the Libyan parties and said, we will not support you if you try to continue the war. And when you remove that international support, the Libyan elite at least, have nowhere to go.
Will Libya then ever be returned to the citizens of the country? And what would be the way to get to that?
I think, and it's deeply ironic, and it does cause a bit of shock every time I state it, but I do think that for all of the criticism and legitimate criticism that Sisi gets as a result of his human rights abuses and the like, Sisi has actually presented the most viable plan to bring an end to the solution in Libya. And Sisi is genuine in this plan, because Sisi has a problem with Sudan, with the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in the East Mediterranean. Sisi wants to wrap up the Libya conflict. He's saying, look, Haftar tried to take Tripoli, he failed. Okay, GNA, well done. Turkey, well done, good on you. Let's debate and start split the cake between us. Egypt is suggesting that there should be elections in the East, elections in the West, and elections in the South. There should be 9 ministers in the West, 7 ministers in the East, 5 ministers in the South. All of these, from these elections, they form a unity government. And that unity government decides on a president and then that will pave the way for nationwide elections. The reason Turkey is objecting to this at the moment is because Turkey believes that in such a situation, it would lose the leverage and gains that it's gained from its intervention, whereby it rescued the GNA. But the reality is that the Cairo initiative is the best possible way forward in terms of trying to bring a solution to Libya. There are two obstacles. The US is worried that Russia will continue to maintain its presence even after elections, and Turkey is concerned that given it hasn't taken Sirte, it will lose the gains that it has made. But Turkey may well agree to the plan once it's fully established the naval base in Masalata and makes that irreversible, and fully establishes the air base in Al-Watiya and makes that irreversible. I think at this moment in time, the Cairo initiative is still on the table. There are protests taking place in Libya. People are watching these protests. The reason the process is slow is because the East is gambling that the protests might bring down the GNA, might bring down the government of international accord. Because it's important to note that what's exacerbating the protest is the oil blockade that Haftar is doing. Haftar is saying, wait a minute, I attacked all of these months to Tripoli and I failed. If I had realized that my oil blockade would force people on the streets against Tripoli, I would have done that on day one. So Haftar is watching very carefully, because Haftar knows that if the war comes to an end, he loses all relevance, particularly as Egypt and Russia are trying to empower his rivals. So the reality is now everybody's watching the protest to see what the Libyans will do. Will these authorities in the East and West survive the protest? If they do, we move on to negotiations. If they don't, we may well go back to war, or there'll be a complete upending of dynamics, and we'll go back to the scenes of uncertainty that we saw following the fall of Gaddafi.
All right, talking about Gaddafi, perhaps in conclusion, what was he able to do to keep the country together, even though in the end, actually, it cost him his life?
I think the key point with regards to the disunity we see in Libya is not necessarily as a result of Gaddafi's policies, but the way Gaddafi was brought down. Tunisia was an organic revolution. You can look at Tunisia and say that 100% the people put so much pressure that Ben Ali couldn't survive. In Egypt, the people put so much pressure that Mubarak had to step down. But in Libya, it was much more complex, and that but for NATO, Gaddafi would not have fallen. So this is the problem. And also in the immediate aftermath of Gaddafi's fall, those militias that had taken down Gaddafi went and embarked on revenge attacks, polarizing society. And I think that was in the immediate aftermath, that's what caused it. I always argue that and I may not be the best, you might be better than me in terms of commenting on this, but when South Africa implemented an amnesty commission, the reason for the amnesty commission, the reason why Nelson Mandela pursued it, was to prevent the very polarization that we're seeing in Libya. This idea of creating a common narrative as to what happened in South Africa, so that society does not have to go through any anti-revolution or any resurrection of any apartheid themes that might overthrow the government and plunge the country back into a war. In Libya, they don't have that. Everybody has their own narrative. It's one party taking revenge on another. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing power grabs by everybody. And I think until there is a common narrative on Libya, until we can speak about Libya honestly and say that but for NATO, Gaddafi would not have fallen, and that it's not an organic Arab Spring that everybody wanted. Gaddafi was a tyrant, but I'm talking about the realities and the facts, the way France came rushing in to get rid of Gaddafi, the way it was desperate for the contracts. When it didn't get it, it decided to back Haftar and back authoritarian regimes. Until the Libyans can come up with a narrative and look at the reflection in the mirror and say, yes, we did some very terrible things in the aftermath of Gaddafi, and we appreciate that it's time to set up and talk about forgiveness, talk about unity, there will not be a solution for Libya.
Sami Hamdi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for those interesting and insightful thoughts about the situation in Libya. And let's hope, for the sake of the citizens on the ground, some solutions can be found. And I think, as you said, maybe this Cairo plan needs to be looked at with a bit more seriousness. Thanks so much indeed, Sami.
Thank you.